Oh my God, he's back. Yes, because I had another thought. So I keep hearing people say the Trump economy was so great. If we could only go back to the Trump economy before we had all this inflation. So this really goes to the heart of why I'm a Democrat and why I really get annoyed with low information voters, also known as Republicans. If you inherit a bad economy with problems and you address those problems and you solve them and pull a good economy out of a bad economy, then that's a good thing. You deserve credit. This problem I have with the Republicans goes back to 1921. We came out of World War I. Guns ablazing. Our economy was ripping and soaring. The stock market was flying. Now, the reason for that primarily is because, unlike in most wars, World War I and World War II had positive effects on the American economy after the war. Why? Two reasons. One, pent-up demand. You had rationing, you had unavailability of products, and you had soldiers, for example, getting paid, couldn't spend their money. All that's built up demand. And then you had a huge transformation in our manufacturing base, primarily because of automobiles. Automobiles includes tanks. Now it's kind of mixing World War I and World War II, but this also was true in World War II. We started making tanks in World War I. We started phasing out the horses and moving in the tanks. And also, just like with the Civil War, with the Winchester, spurred an economic boom in the post-Civil War America. This was a lot of it had to do with military spending. Period. Also investments into planes, which was later manifested itself more dramatically in World War II. But we were building an economic infrastructure and demand at the same time, and those two came together to cause an explosion in our economy. And that was during the Wilson administration. He died. Then along came Warren G. Harding. Warren G. Harding died during his first administration, and he was succeeded by Calvin Coolidge. And then after Calvin Coolidge, he finished the Harding administration. Then he had one of his own for 4 years, and then Herbert Hoover. And all during that Roaring '20s, you've heard the term. Well, some of you have. The Roaring '20s, the economy continued to roar. Started before the Roaring '20s, continued on through the Roaring '20s, all the way up to the end of the Roaring '20s. So we had a decade of economic boom time. But that economic boom time was started under a Democratic administration, the administration of Woodrow Wilson, for reasons that I just explained, simplified, but more or less that's why. So what happened with Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover? 4 tax cuts. 4 tax cuts, primarily like all Republican tax cuts, directed to the wealthy. The result of which was they were laying the groundwork for the destruction of our economy with those tax cuts and without any proper regulation. So the banks were all set up for a run on the banks. When that happened, it was a hemorrhage, a massive hemorrhage. So that was, and that all came to fruition in 1929 with the stock market crash. But the stock market crash wasn't just the market. The stock market crashed because the economy was crashing. And then we had the horrible 30s. So Roosevelt then came in as a Democrat, having inherited, so these 3 Republicans inherited a roaring economy, and at the end of their 3 administrations, consecutive administrations, we had the Great Depression. That's the main reason I'm a Democrat, because I remember that history. So, yeah, I'm older than I look. Okay, maybe not, but I'm old, and I was a young lawyer in 1929. Okay, occasionally I stretch the truth. I just do it for effect. So I wasn't a young lawyer in 1929. I was barely in law school. So 1932, Roosevelt gets elected. he inherits a terrible economy, the worst ever, the Great Depression. He goes to work. He puts in all this alphabet soup, all these regulations. He froze the banks and then he opened them under insurance. All of this alphabet soup that we have now, which is all the government regulations about which Republicans continue to complain to this day, saved that economy, stabilized the American economy, stabilized the American banking system, stabilized the stock market. And by the end of Roosevelt's administration, our economy was stronger than ever, which was a good thing because by then we were in World War II. I actually was alive at that time. I don't remember Roosevelt because he was elected his last term a week before I was born. Coincidence? I don't think so. I'm not sure what the significance is, but still, it's a coincidence that I was born just a week after Roosevelt was elected for his last term, and he was getting close to death. But I was there, and I had to pick up the slack. In the meantime, I let Harry Truman be my caretaker. So, here we are. Now Roosevelt has pulled us out of the Great Depression. We're doing all kinds of things, which did not include massive tax cuts. It's always about tax cuts with Republicans. Always, starting really with Warren G. Harding. So then we have Harry Truman. We had a good economy during Truman. And then we had Eisenhower. Well, Eisenhower, I was very critical of Eisenhower when I was a youngster because I thought he really didn't do much, and he really didn't do much, but he did stand up to Israel over the Suez Canal. He did integrate the schools, even though he didn't believe in it, and he was responsible for the federal highway system. So that's not much in 8 years, but it wasn't a big negative either. And the other good thing that he did is that our national debt was zero. Now the taxes against the wealthy, I'm always saying they should be taxed more, but they were really out of control. I mean, it was almost like confiscatory tax rates, which is one of the reasons Kennedy set about to lower those, because they were just way too high. But that was the end of Eisenhower's administration. What did we have? Actually, we had, I think, it's my recollection, as I recall, we had either 3 or 2 recessions during Eisenhower's 8 years. The last one of which was ongoing during the Kennedy-Nixon election, which is one of the reasons, frankly, that Kennedy won. So Kennedy comes in, and right away he goes to work. So he inherits a recession. He inherited an economy in malaise. He inherited a country pretty much in malaise. And he just came in with his knock'em sock'em energy and his great personality and his beautiful family and a whole litany of let's go get 'em policies, including Medicare, which is like thank you for the Medicare, and all the Republicans who voted against it, who are his progeny, are like sucking that up, man. Well, good for you. Just like with Social Security, as my uncle, a staunch Republican, used to admit to me that he said, the Republicans actually never forgave Franklin Roosevelt for Social Security, and I think the Republicans have pretty much forgiven Kennedy for Medicare since they're all on it now. But it was he had a list a mile long, and I could spend hours talking about the accomplishments of Kennedy's administration in 3 years. So he was an amazing president and an amazing human being. But he inherited a bad economy. By the time he left, our economy was roaring again. Then Lyndon Johnson came along, the economy continued roaring. Then it got overheated. And then Nixon inherited a bad economy from Johnson. And Nixon really, I give Nixon more credit now than I used to. As a president, his policies were not that bad. And he didn't slash taxes. And he didn't, try to repeal Medicare and Social Security and everything that Republicans have been doing. And don't let them lie to you that they're not after Social Security, because they are. You hear it in their talking points. But Nixon didn't really do that much that was bad. I think he prolonged the Vietnam War for 4 years longer than it needed to be. His shortcomings were of a personal nature. He was petty. He was dishonest. He was paranoid. But policy-wise, he wasn't that bad. Remember, Nixon and Kennedy, pay attention, you people who are historically challenged, when Truman wanted to put together the Marshall Plan to basically save the economy of Europe, which they did, which we needed for our own stability, which also included NATO. Trump, listen up. Trump's younger than I am, which maybe that's why he doesn't know anything about history. He wasn't even alive during while all this was going on. So, not that he's barely alive today, but hey, who am I to be snide, right? Sometimes. So Kennedy and Nixon, when Truman wanted to put together the Marshall Plan, he called in these two rising stars, two young congressmen, and put it in their hands to shepherd this thing through the Congress. And of course, we know they were Jack Kennedy and Richard Nixon, who became pretty good friends, and actually stayed friends, even though they had a harsh campaign between the two of them. They still remained friends, and Nixon was wonderful to the Kennedy family after Kennedy's death. Lyndon Johnson never invited any of the Kennedy family to the White House. Nixon had Jackie Kennedy and the kids over there all the time. So nobody knew about that, and I did, because I'm a nerd and I follow this stuff. No, I'm not a nerd, but I do follow this stuff. So Nixon wasn't that bad. Eisenhower wasn't that bad. Gerald Ford was great. And why do I say that? He not only went to Michigan, he not only played football for Michigan, he was an All-American. Now, he blew it by going to Yale Law School, but as far as I'm concerned, he's a fellow Michigan alum, and therefore the greatest president that we ever had. Lincoln. He didn't even go to college, much less Michigan. Jack Kennedy couldn't get into Michigan. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt couldn't get into Michigan. Franklin Roosevelt couldn't get into Michigan. The list of American presidents who couldn't get into Michigan is a mile long. The only one besides Gerald Ford who actually got admitted but didn't attend was Warren G. Harding. So, Warren G. Harding wasn't admitted to Michigan. I made that up. I wanted to look more inclusive. I threw in a Republican. But Gerald Ford was a Republican too, in name only. Gerald Ford actually, in the short time that he was president, in my opinion, was a pretty good president. So I didn't want to go into it now because it's not the Gerald Ford hour, and I have forgiven him for the Chuck and when it was Charlie and Ev's show, the Ev and Charlie show. Charlie Halleck, who was a congressman from Indiana, and I'm sort of from Indiana. My dad knew Charlie Halleck very well, didn't care much for him. And then Everett Dirksen, they used to have this once a week TV show where they would get on and bash Kennedy. They stopped doing that as soon as he was killed. Can't blame him for that. So that brings us up to Gerald Ford, and then we had Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was not particularly good as a Democratic president, which is one of the reasons that Ted Kennedy ran against him for the nomination. And Ted Kennedy's running against him was the big reason that Jimmy Carter lost to Ronald Reagan, because many people, like I didn't vote in that election. That's the only election in which I've not voted. And I just couldn't bring myself to vote for Carter, and I obviously wasn't going to vote for Ronald Reagan. So that was kind of a wash. The problem that we had with Carter, that Kennedy had with Carter, that I had with Carter, that many American Democrats had with Carter, was he wouldn't use the power of the government to deal with the crisis that he had. He had a monstrous inflation problem, largely because of OPEC. But he also didn't do anything about not about inflation, but about jobs, about a whole raft of issues problems that he faced, because his view of government was sort of the Republican view, which is government is best which governs least. Which my view, and the view I think of most Democrats, is government is best which looks at problems and tries to figure out ways to solve them. And anybody can take hands off and say, my answer to the problems is to not do anything about them, which is the typical Republican philosophy. Don't do anything except lower taxes. It takes a certain amount of courage and intelligence and determination and dedication to solving the problems. So first you have to recognize the problems, then you have to say, what can I, as a member of the government, do to solve them? Now, sometimes they overreach. I think the Democrats overreach with spending a lot of times. And it's a legitimate function of the Republicans, in my mind, has been to sort of pull that back and act as a brake on the Democrats. But when the Republicans are in charge, what do? What has this last Congress, this Republican Congress, done? It hasn't done a damn thing. Not a single piece of legislation of any significance has been passed with this latest Republican Congress. it's contrary to their philosophy. And Jimmy Carter sort of had the same philosophy, which is why Teddy Kennedy ran against him. Now people don't understand why. That's why. So then along comes Ronald Reagan. So now we have the beginning of terrible governance by Republicans that it's like nails on a blackboard. When I hear people talk about, oh, Ronald Reagan was a great president. Ronald Reagan was a terrible president. He had good demeanor, which actually I give him credit for that, because that is part of being a president. One of the things I liked about Kennedy was he had a great demeanor, great personality. He was a leader. He brought people along, and Reagan had that same thing. Both Irishmen. So Reagan had that. He had charm. He had personality, and he was also good on the Cold War, as was Kennedy, as was basically virtually every president before him. Unlike Trump, who seems to think that it's okay to give Russia a pass, I guess because they're not, quote, communists anymore. But they still have that same mentality, which goes all the way back to Peter the Great. And someday I'll tell you about visiting his castle, not his castle, but his palace in St. Petersburg. Now, if I were Biden and said that, you'd say, oh, look at, you're losing your mind. Oh, no, 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 no. And incidentally, Biden does stutter, which we'll talk about that later. I just saw Donald Trump making fun of Biden because he stutters. I was a phys ed instructor at the University of Michigan speech therapy camp for 3 years. And I tell you, I have seen stutters, lots of them, up close, and the way these people struggle is horrible. And for somebody to make fun of them is just disgusting. For that reason alone, you should never vote for Donald Trump. What kind of a human being makes fun of another human being's disabilities? I digress. But that kiss came to mind because I saw him doing that this morning on TV, and I said, what kind of a piece of are you, as a human being, to make fun of a person's disability? Anyway, so Ronald Reagan, policy-wise, was terrible, and here's what he did. First thing he did was the same thing George Bush Jr. did, the same thing Donald Trump did. He goes into office and immediately, bam, let's slash taxes for the wealthiest people in the country, the biggest corporations, the wealthiest people, the people who don't need it one iota. Let's cut their taxes to the bone. And of course, the first thing that does is drives the hell up the national debt. Unless you're willing to cut spending, Ronald Reagan was suffering through Reaganomics in his first 4 years, and toward the close of that 4 years, he started spending like crazy. Jimmy Carter did the same thing, started spending like crazy in order to stimulate the economy. But when you're stimulating the economy while you're having a massive tax cut in place, and he stimulated the economy mainly by Reagan with military spending, then what happens is you blow a hole in the national debt. The national debt trebled under Ronald Reagan's 2 administrations. Trebled. And the result of and they didn't do anything to keep an eye on the banks, which is where so many of these problems originate, is on the banking system. So the banks were on the verge of collapse because of terrible, shoddy loans that were not inspected by the federal government to make sure that these loans were valid and solid. You know, kind of like Deutsche Bank with Trump. They just turned a blind eye and they said, hands off. We're going to take hands off of basically doing anything to interfere with the private sector, except in the antitrust laws where it came to Bell Telephone at all, which we can discuss at a later date. I know something about that because I'm an antitrust lawyer as well. So, but anyway, that other than that one instance, that basically they were hands off. The Justice Department was not enforcing the antitrust laws. And they just basically took hands off and let people do whatever the hell they wanted to do, in the meantime running up a huge deficit. You know how bad that deficit was? I'll tell you how bad that deficit was. Ronald Reagan ran out of money. What? Ronald Reagan, for those of you who think he was a great president, is the first president that I know of who ran out of money. Listen to me whisper. I sound like that Republican woman who was something from the House of Horrors, giving her rebuttal speech with a throaty, Joe Biden. Anyway, that was a pretty good imitation. You have to admit, there was a lot of talent went into that. I know, I could have been somebody, but I'm not. So what? I don't really need it. I got you. Oops, because I don't have you anymore either. Huh. Can't believe everybody turned me off at the same time. That's really rude and hurts me because I'm a sensitive person. Poisonous, I would say, if I were from Jersey. I got to tell you my story about Joyzy drivers down here in Florida one of these days. Yeah, another digression. Stop it, Ed. Let's get back on track. I was talking about Ronald Reagan. Ran out of money. How do I know? Because I pay attention to details. So what Ronald Reagan did was he had slashed taxes. Then he had exploded government spending. The national debt had trebled. So what do? You got to keep the government going. You can't just shut down the government and say, "Hey, folks, we're broke." Yeah, I cut down your source of income. I spent like a drunken sailor, which is not fair to drunken sailors, incidentally. And now, I'm sorry to tell the union in the State of the Union address, we're out of money. We're broke. What do you do when you're running out of money? Contrary to popular belief, you can't just go down and get the printing press out of the basement of the White House. You borrow. And how does the government borrow money? It sells bonds. So these big banks go there, and I've represented a company that was in the federal bond industry. That was the only thing they did. It was founded by some former executives of Merrill Lynch, and they just did bonds. They would go at these auctions. They would bid. They would get hundreds of millions of dollars worth of bonds, and then they would sell those bonds to their customers, mainly banks. So most of you probably don't know this. I didn't know it. There's a relatively few amount of companies that are authorized, at least back then, it's a while back, or authorized to bid for bonds at open auction from the federal government. They are the ones that in turn then sell them to everybody else. They sell them to the banks then sell them to you, and off we are. Well, guess what? No one was bidding anymore. Because the people who buy these bonds, they don't give a damn what party you are. They want to know the financial health of the person to whom they are lending money. And when you buy bonds, you're lending money to the person selling those bonds. And the government basically was the person selling the bonds. It's actually the Fed, but that's a whole different issue. So, and the Federal Reserve Banks. A whole different issue. But the bottom line is, they're going to be paid back by the federal government. And the federal government is running such a cash deficiency that they have to raise the interest rates they pay to an astronomical level. You're not going to buy them. So they couldn't sell enough bonds to raise enough money to keep the government functioning. So what did they do? They raised taxes. That was the big Reagan tax increase. Really? I thought Reagan just cut taxes. He cut income taxes. He got together with Tip O'Neill, and basically I was critical of O'Neill at the time, still am somewhat, but it wasn't his fault. But these people together, they were friends, they had to find a way to keep the government from going under. So they hit upon this. We'll raise Social Security taxes. We'll take that, which will give Social Security a surplus. The way we'll do it is we'll lie to the American people and tell them Social Security is running out of money and we have to have this increase in Social Security taxes to save Social Security. That was a lie. And I knew it at the time, but most of you didn't because most of you weren't born. So they raised Social Security taxes, and then that money went into Social Security, which was now running a massive surplus of hundreds of billions of dollars a year. What are you going to do with that money? Oh, I know. We will loan that money to the federal government itself, who will then buy these bonds from us. Where we will use our cash reserves. I mean, our cash, not reserve. Well, reserve. What the excess over what they were paying out. This huge surplus. Social Security, which is a separate body within the government, set up to function independently. Social Security then took its money and it started buying the bonds that Ronald Reagan couldn't sell to private investors. So they sold them to Social Security. So now they got the Social Security money came into the government, and the government gave bonds to Social Security, which still holds a lot of bonds. And Social Security is sitting there with a bunch of bonds that they know they're never going to get paid, because the government, under that scheme of Ronald Reagan, was continuing to run at a massive deficit. But at least for the next 3 years of his administration, he had a flow of money coming in from Social Security. And we're still doing that today. And now Social Security is like running out of money. Well, all Social Security should have to do is go to the government and say, pay us back all the money you borrowed. Yeah. Fat chance, since the government has the same problem today that it had back then. It's running out of money. And so this was what Ronald Reagan put in place. And people who say Ronald Reagan was a great president don't know anything about economics. They don't have any understanding of the history of this country and the impact of these tax cuts going back to Warren G. Harding. And this whole issue really goes back to before the Civil War. It actually goes back to the Revolutionary War, but I don't have time to go back that far. But in immediate modern history, starting in 1920, this is what we've been dealing with. And Ronald Reagan was one of the worst presidents, and he had a degree in economics from some college in Wheaton or something like that, Illinois. But at least he had an economics degree, so he should have known the basics. He should have known the fundamentals. And he was a Democrat when Roosevelt was president. He saw the use of Keynesian economics to stimulate and control the economy. But Keynesian didn't mean anything. He had this guy, I forgot his name now, little chubby-faced little guy that had the charts. And he listened to that guy who was a nobody and who got every prediction he made went wrong. Yeah, he predicted we'd have a surplus by the tax cut. Yeah, we cut our income and that's going to result in a surplus because it's going to stimulate the economy so much. Well, it didn't. He was as wrong as he could be, and I saw him not too long ago. He's still running around spouting the same nonsense that, to three people in an auditorium. And it's always the same three people. And guess what? They're dead. It's almost like listening to that Republican give the rebuttal to Biden's State of the Union. For some reason, Republicans do things that just make you go, feels good. Try that yourself. I know. I should have been on TV. Oh, I am on TV. Okay, so that was Reagan. Exit Reagan. In comes George Bush Sr. George Bush Sr. now inherited a terrible economy from Reagan because even though it was all roses when Bush Sr. took over, what happened was this whole bank thing exploded. We had to bail out the banks. Then we had to have all this program of the federal government coming in and buying real estate that they had foreclosed on. The whole thing was a complete total mess because of Ronald Reagan. And then George Bush did something that he said he would never do, which was he raised taxes. I forget how they did it, but they did raise some taxes. The Republicans never forgave him for it, and he tried hard. And I think George Bush Sr. was a good person, and although he ran a dirty campaign against Michael Dukakis, that was horrible. Atkins, who was his campaign manager, apologized to Dukakis on his deathbed in the hospital. He put out a handbook for this. I'm talking about Atkins now, and he put out a handbook on how Republicans should win elections, and he said, "Don't discuss the issues; just attack your opponent personally." It was right there in the handbook of the Republican Party. For some reason, the press never picked up on it. But I'm sorry, I said Atkins. It was Atwater. Atwater was the guy's name, not Atkins. Atwater, and Lee Atwater. Lee Atwater was Ronald Reagan's campaign manager. He was the chairman of the Republican Party, and he's the one who said, "Hey, there's no such thing as dirty politics." So, and he knew what he was doing was wrong. It's, nothing like a hanging to focus the mind, right? Well, he was dying of cancer, and it focused the mind, and he was sorry for what he did. I was sorry for what he did while he was doing it. But aside from that, I think George Bush Sr. was a good man, and he recognized the horrible situation he had walked into. He was vice president at the time, after all, but he never was a profile in courage. When Reagan was president, he was just like Mike Pence. Oh yeah, whatever you say, and they stand here and they applaud. So it's just a shame. But anyway, so at the end of that disastrous administration, that wasn't his fault. Bill Clinton comes in. He inherits a terrible economy, just like Franklin Roosevelt did. He went to work. And I'm not going to go into his policies, but at the end of the Clinton administration, the economy was in solid shape. The annual deficit was we were running surpluses. That surplus was being used to pay down the debt which I think when he left office it was like 100 billion, and it was I mean like, yeah, it was like 100 billion, and it was going down. I could be wrong on that, but it was something in that range. It was on a glide path to be gone altogether within 10 years. Then George Bush Jr. comes in, and right out of the Ronald Reagan playbook, he slashes taxes. He took money that was already been accumulated to pay the surplus. Instead of using it for that, he gave it to people. He gave a bunch of it to his brother down here in Florida for investment to help the Florida's economy grow, which it didn't need at the time, and just pissed all that away. And as a result, we had another economy which was in shambles at the time that Barack Obama took over. Barack Obama came in, labored mightily, pulled the economy back, raised some taxes, as little as he could, because all those Bush tax cuts were always in play until the very end of Obama's administration. He finally got some tax. He got rid of one of the tax cuts because it was temporary, and then some money started coming back into the government, and actually started reducing the annual deficit, not the debt. But at the end of his economy of Barack Obama's administration, we had, I think it was like 4.5% unemployment, maybe a little higher than that, but it had gone from like really close to 10 to down to like 4. It was, gone from depression levels of unemployment down to essentially full employment in 8 years. The stock market was at record highs. Our economy was roaring. It was a great economy. So here you go. So Roosevelt inherits a terrible economy, turns it around. Bill Clinton inherits a terrible economy, turns it around. Barack Obama inherits a terrible economy, turns it around. Donald Trump inherits a great economy, which is my point when I was going to start this lecture. Barack Obama left a wonderful economy in place. Donald Trump comes in, cuts taxes for the wealthy. That's his only legislative accomplishment in 4 years. And for the first 2 years, approximately, the economy was in great shape. So people say, oh, that was the Trump economy. No, it wasn't. It was the Barack Obama economy. Trump had nothing to do with it. He just sat there. Anybody can inherit a bunch of money and sit there and say, oh, look at all the money I have. I must be brilliant. I used to live in Palm Beach. I saw that all the time. These people inherited, tens of millions. It was back there. That meant something. Tens of millions of dollars from their great-grandparents, and they thought they were important because they inherited all this money. Well, you're not important because you inherit money. You're not important because you inherit a great economy. You don't get credit for a great economy that you inherit from your predecessor. So please, stop talking about Donald Trump's great economy. Then along came COVID. So here you have Donald Trump, who has no background in government. He didn't know what the heck he was doing. And our economy starts tanking now. Part of it was because they had to give out money to keep businesses alive, like restaurants all over this country were going under because people couldn't go to them. And even if they could, they wouldn't. So they had all these people working for restaurants who were going to go unemployed, and so to Trump's credit, he was responsible for a lot of these payments that went out. Payments that later resulted in inflation, but at the time they put them out. Now, why did they result in inflation? Because of the tax cuts, there wasn't enough money in the federal coffers to take care of these increased expenses required by COVID. Now, I'm not going to talk about the other mishandling of COVID for which he was responsible. And the man was an idiot when you saw him up there talking about injecting bleach into bloodstreams, and Dr. Fauci sitting there going, "My God, what am I going to do about this idiot?" And then you've got all these Republicans criticizing Fauci because he wouldn't go along with Trump's not. It's like, what kind of a world do these people live in? Yeah, I mean, what kind of drugs are they taking all the time? Are they taking COVID relief drugs? No, well, they won't get the injection, so it's not that. Where do they come up with this stuff? Praise Donald Trump, who stood up there and talked about injecting bleach into your bloodstream, and criticized Dr. Fauci, who was actually doing the best he could with a terrible situation. So it's just these people are all about politics, which is one of the reasons I get so angry with them. Instead of trying to solve problems, they want an issue on which they can campaign. It happens all the time, and these people that go along with them, and if you vote for Republicans, you know what I'm talking about. You vote for them based on the nonsense they say instead of on what the facts really are. And what I'm trying to do with all of you is to get you to look at facts like I do as a lawyer. Look for the facts. Forget the slogans. Forget the platitudes. Don't say Donald Trump had a great economy when he inherited a great economy. Don't say Donald Trump was really on top of COVID when he stood in front of television and spouted ignorance constantly. He was the most ignorant person I've ever heard when it comes to some basic physics. It's just, I have a physics degree. I know a little something about basic physics. I know a lot about a lot of stuff. Not everything. And what I don't have is talent, except for singing. Someday I want to talk, when I talk about, what is life really all about, is this whole business of people who have talent. And where does that come from? Interesting thought. If you're one of those people who has talent, maybe you know. I don't have a lot of talent, but I do have a lot of knowledge. Just like Joe Biden. So, enough of that nonsense. It brings us back to, so Donald Trump, we had a pretty bad economy when Donald Trump left office. You could say, well, that wasn't his fault. COVID. He had a great economy before. Yeah, he had the great Barack Obama economy before. Then along came COVID. He had the combination COVID-Trump economy, and Joe Biden inherited that. And because of his policies, and there are almost as many as John Kennedy, actually more in terms of being successful. Because of that, our economy is the strongest economy in the world, and the strongest it's ever been. I don't care what people want to whine about, but they all say, oh, the gasoline prices are so high, and then they pour into their cars by the millions. Every time there's a holiday, they set new record turnout for miles driven by people who say we can't afford the price of gasoline. It's annoying. Anyway, be that as it may, Biden inherited a bad economy, turned it around. So we have example after example after example of a Democratic president inheriting a terrible economy and turning it around. And you have example after example of Republican presidents inheriting a great economy and blowing it. So let's be honest. First place, let's be educated about the history of American economics, and then let's be honest about it. So on that little note, urging you to be honest, I'm going to say goodbye. And this time, I'm promising I'm not coming back anymore today. But you've heard that from me before, too. You're not required to watch. Yes, you are.